Imagine you are a high-ranking British diplomat. It's the autumn of 1956.
Right, arguably at the center of the world.
Exactly. You are sitting in a mahogany-paneled office in Whitehall. Your nation possesses nuclear weapons. You have a sprawling global empire.
And one of the most sophisticated, battle-tested militaries on the face of the earth.
Yeah. You are, by every traditional metric, a titan. Yet in a matter of days, just a few men looking at financial spreadsheets across the Atlantic in Washington, D.C. are going to force you into a humiliating, unconditional global surrender.
And they will do it without firing a single bullet.
Right, not one bullet. So how does a superpower collapse overnight? Today, in 2026, the debate over the potential end of American hegemony is louder than ever. Is this a unique crisis or a recurring historical reset?
I mean, that is the defining question of our era. And to answer it, we have to recognize that the vast majority of the discourse happening right now, on the news, online, is obsessing over the wrong variables.
We get caught in this cycle of surface-level analysis.
Totally. We look at the daily political scandals, the immediate economic shocks, the geopolitical flashpoints, and we treat them as the disease. But they are not the disease.
No, they're the symptoms.
Exactly. They are merely the symptoms of much deeper, invisible thermodynamic shifts.
So the mission of this deep dive is to look past that daily noise. To understand what is truly happening around you, you need to examine the underlying thermodynamic and structural forces that dictate the lifespan of empires.
Because history doesn't just happen by accident.
Right. We are going to look at a massive stack of historical texts, complexity science models, archaeological data, and economic theory. The goal is to decode the exact blueprint of societal collapse and transformation.
And to do that, we have to start by redefining what a civilization actually is. I mean, a civilization is not a static entity.
It's not just a collection of grand monuments.
No, or a set of borders drawn on a map, or even just a shared cultural heritage. At its absolute core, a civilization is a complex problem-solving engine.
Okay, let's unpack this. What do you mean by a problem-solving engine?
Well, when any society faces a stressor, whether that stressor is an explosion in population growth, an invading army, or a sudden shift in climate, it responds by building infrastructure.
And it creates systems.
Yes. It builds social infrastructure, political bureaucracy, and physical technology to solve that specific problem.
Because that infrastructure comes with a profound energetic and economic cost. Before we can diagnose a collapse, we really need to understand the physical laws of how history actually moves.
We have to step out of the anxiety of our current news cycle and enter what we might call the theoretical physics of history.
Which requires a totally different lens. Specifically, the one pioneered by the French historian Fernand Braudel and the Annales School of History.
Oh, Braudel's framework is indispensable here. He fundamentally rejected what he called l'histoire événementielle.
Which translates roughly to event-driven history, right?
Right. This is the history of the short term.
Yeah.
The assassinations, the specific battles, the daily political maneuvering.
The stuff that fills up our news feeds today.
Exactly. Braudel argued that if you fixate on these rapid, explosive events, you are essentially blinded by the dust of the immediate. You miss the actual mechanics of change. True history, he posited, operates on the longue durée.
The long duration. These are the slow-moving geographic, environmental, and structural forces that take centuries to unfold.
Right.
It's like plate tectonics versus the weather. We obsess over the daily thunderstorms, who won an election, what scandal broke on social media today.
Yeah, the daily noise.
But the longue durée is the tectonic plates grinding against each other miles beneath the surface. You don't notice the plates moving during your daily commute.
No, of course not.
You only notice them when the earthquake finally hits. But the pressure for that earthquake has been mathematically building for centuries.
That tectonic analogy captures the mechanics perfectly. I mean, through this longue durée lens, Braudel introduced the concept of the économie monde, the economy world.
The center of gravity for global power.
Exactly. He mapped out how global economic dominance, the absolute center of global capitalism and geopolitical power, never remains static. It shifts, almost like clockwork, between core urban centers over long epochs.
He traced this shift from Venice in the late Middle Ages, right?
Right. From Venice to Antwerp to Genoa to Amsterdam and eventually to London.
And each of those cities followed the exact same trajectory. They built a massively complex network of long-distance trade. They extracted incredible wealth from the periphery of their networks. They became the undisputed masters of their known world.
And then, inevitably, they collapsed under the weight of their own systems, passing the torch to a new geographic core.
Which forces us to ask the foundational question of this briefing. Why? Why can't a dominant power, once it has secured all the wealth and military might in the world, simply stay dominant forever?
Why did Venice fall? Why did Amsterdam lose its grip?
Right. To answer the mechanics of that decay, we have to layer Braudèl's historical timeline with the anthropological models of Joseph Tainter.
Tainter is essential here. He introduced a thermodynamic view of society that completely revolutionizes how we understand the life cycle of empires.
Yeah, his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, is basically the operating manual for this dynamic.
It really is. He points out that when a society hits a problem, its default mechanism is to increase its socio-political complexity.
So if you have a crime problem, you don't just ask people to behave.
No, you create a police force, a judicial system, a sprawling network of prisons, and a legislative body to write the laws. You specialize your workforce, you add layers of management.
And in the early stages of a civilization's growth, that investment in complexity works beautifully. It yields a highly favorable return.
Right. Tainter refers to this as an energy subsidy. When a society first organizes a unified military and conquers a neighboring territory, the caloric and economic wealth brought back, like the plundered gold, the new agricultural land, the captive labor far exceeds the cost of organizing that army.
The society experiences a golden age of surplus.
Exactly.
But wait, hasn't technology always bailed us out of this trap? Like if we run out of a resource, or if a system gets too bloated, we just invent a new technology.
That's the assumption, right?
We ran out of whale oil, so we figured out how to drill for petroleum. Why wouldn't a highly advanced society just innovate its way out of the complexity trap?
That is the most common counter-argument, and Tainter addresses it brilliantly by applying the law of declining marginal returns to innovation itself.
Ah, right.
A society will always grab the lowest hanging fruit first. The easiest, cheapest scientific discoveries and technological leaps are made early on. Think about the massive leaps in human life expectancy we achieved simply by discovering basic sanitation and penicillin.
Those were relatively cheap innovations that yielded monumental societal returns.
Right. But today, to increase human life expectancy by just a few more months, we have to spend billions of dollars on hyper-advanced gene therapies and specialized oncology wings.
The cost of the next breakthrough becomes exponentially higher.
Precisely the mechanic Tainter warns about. Eventually, a society runs out of easy solutions.
The bureaucracy becomes so layered, the infrastructure so sprawling, and the required technological leaps so expensive that massive investments of energy, capital, and labor yield almost zero additional benefit.
The society reaches the critical threshold of declining marginal returns. At this point, simply maintaining the status quo, just keeping the lights on and the borders secure, consumes nearly all of the society's available energy and capital.
Think of civilization as a poorly built ladder.
I love this analogy.
When you start climbing, the ground is right beneath you. If you fall, you dust yourself off. But as you climb higher to escape the problems below, the steps beneath you begin to rot and fall away.
You can't go backward.
You can't. Eventually, you are teetering hundreds of feet in the air. The effort required just to hold on to the ladder takes all your strength, and any drop from that height is fatal.
And when a society is at the top of that precarious ladder, it becomes hypersensitive to what Tainter calls stress surges.
And a stress surge could be anything, right?
Anything. A multi-year drought, a novel pandemic, a minor skirmish on a distant border. Because the society is spending 99% of its energy just maintaining its vast complexity, it has no surplus left to absorb the new shock.
Which leads to Tainter's most counterintuitive and frankly terrifying conclusion. Collapse is not a tragedy in the thermodynamic sense. Collapse is an economizing process.
Yes, it is a mathematical inevitability.
When a society can no longer afford the daily operating costs of its own complexity, the system violently, forcibly restructures itself back down to a sustainable level of resource use.
Collapse is just gravity taking hold of a balance sheet that no longer makes sense.
Right. But that thermodynamic strain, the crushing cost of complexity, is never distributed equally across the population.
Never.
This brings us to the internal structural mechanics of how a society actually tears itself apart. While Tainter gives us the overall energy math, Peter Turchin gives us the demographic ignition switch.
Turchin pioneered cliodynamics, which is the application of complex mathematical modeling to historical processes. He doesn't just read historical texts.
He builds massive databases, right, of wages, health outcomes, elite sizes, and state debt.
Exactly. To track how structural demographic pressures act as a centrifugal force on a society.
And Turchin identified a mechanism he calls the wealth pump. Think of the economy like a massive, multi-tiered water fountain.
In a healthy, growing society, the wealth shoots to the top, but it splashes generously down to all the tiers below. Wages grow alongside elite fortunes.
But during the later stages of an empire, as complexity costs soar, the mechanics of the fountain change. The elite effectively install a massive vacuum at the top.
The wealth pump begins moving resources disproportionately upward. The top fraction of a percent becomes astronomically wealthy, while the wages, living standards, and purchasing power of the general population completely stagnate or even decline.
Turchin refers to this phase as popular immiseration. The social contract begins to fray because the lower tiers of the fountain are running completely dry.
And if you're wondering what this looks like in practice, you just have to look at the disparity between worker productivity and wages over a multi-decade period.
The masses are working harder, producing more, but taking home a smaller slice of the pie.
Right.
But according to Turchin, the anger of the masses isn't actually what causes the final collapse, right?
No, and that is the crucial pivot in cliodynamics. Peasant revolts or working-class uprisings rarely succeed on their own. They lack the resources, the coordination, and the institutional leverage.
The fatal blow actually comes from what the wealth pump does to the top of the pyramid.
Exactly. The pump creates a phenomenon Turchin calls elite overproduction.
This is such a vital concept to grasp. If you have a massive vacuum sucking all the wealth to the top, suddenly the top tier expands.
You don't just have a few wealthy aristocrats anymore. You have a sprawling class of multimillionaires, highly credentialed academics, and ambitious political operators.
But the number of power seats in a society is structurally fixed. There is only one Oval Office.
There are only a set number of Senate seats, Supreme Court benches, and elite corporate boardrooms. Elite overproduction means you suddenly have thousands of fiercely ambitious, highly resourced individuals who have played by the rules.
They acquired the elite credentials, and now they expect their promised seat at the table.
But the chairs are all taken.
If you want a modern parallel, look at the job market for advanced degrees. You have legions of young people who did everything right, took on massive debt to get law degrees or PhDs from prestigious institutions.
Only to find themselves fighting over a handful of underpaid adjunct positions or entry-level corporate gigs.
They were promised the elite life, and they feel deeply existentially cheated.
And what's fascinating here is that those frustrated individuals do not quietly accept defeat. They form what Turchin calls a counter-elite.
They are highly educated, they understand how to manipulate media and institutions, and they are furious at the established order that denied them their status.
So they look down at the immiserated masses, they harness that boiling popular anger, and they weaponize it against the incumbent elites.
It becomes a hyper-competitive, zero-sum war for the remaining resources. Turchin compares this dynamic to the accumulation of deadwood in a sprawling forest.
Through mathematical modeling, you can measure exactly how fast the deadwood, the elite friction, and popular immiseration is piling up.
You can calculate when the forest is structurally primed for a catastrophic fire.
Right. You cannot predict exactly which lightning strike or dropped match will ignite the blaze. The triggering event, an assassination, a rigged election, a minor banking panic, is unpredictable.
But the mathematical accumulation of the deadwood guarantees that once the spark catches, the resulting conflagration is entirely inevitable. The structure is built to burn.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have the theoretical physics of history. We have Braudèl's shifting tectonic plates, Tainter's collapsing ladder of complexity, and Turchin's combustible deadwood.
But theoretical math is cold.
Right, let's look at how this deadwood actually ignites in human lives. Let's transition from the physics of collapse to the bloody, chaotic reality of our first case study, the late Roman Republic.
We are focusing on the period from roughly 133 BC down to the rise of Augustus.
We are going to see the wealth pump and elite overproduction operate with devastating clarity.
The Roman Republic serves as the ultimate, heavily documented blueprint of how internal institutional decay completely dismantles a superpower.
To understand its fall, we have to look at its original design.
Yes, the institutions of the Republic, the Senate, the consuls, the tribunes were engineered for a relatively modest Italian city-state.
The entire system relied on a delicate, almost paranoid balance of power. The elite aristocrats possessed a mutual trust, bound by a strict social code.
And the military power rested entirely on a massive base of free, land-owning citizen farmers who served in the legions.
But then Rome does what empires do. It expands. It conquers the Mediterranean. It defeats its great rival Carthage in the Punic Wars. It subjugates Greece. It sweeps through the Hellenistic East.
And this wasn't just a series of military victories. This was the opening of a thermodynamic floodgate.
An unprecedented influx of wealth, plundered silver, foreign grain, and hundreds of thousands of human slaves flooded back into the Italian peninsula.
Which brings us to the great paradox of the Republic's fall. Rome was richer, more powerful, and more secure from external threats than at any point in its history.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If the Romans were richer than ever, why did that wealth act as a catalyst for their destruction rather than their salvation?
Because the wealth pump was turned on at maximum velocity.
That plundered wealth did not go to the common Roman soldier who had spent years fighting in Spain or Macedonia.
No, the spoils of war were heavily, almost exclusively, concentrated in the hands of the senatorial elite and the equestrian business class.
And what did these newly hyper-wealthy elites do with all that capital? They looked for somewhere to park it, they bought up land.
They created sprawling, industrialized agricultural megastates known as latifundia, and this is where the thermodynamic math turned lethal for the Republic.
To build these latifundia, the elites systematically displaced the traditional Roman citizen farmer.
Let's trace the life of one of those farmers to see how this worked. You are a Roman citizen. You own a small plot of land in central Italy.
You are drafted into the legions to fight in a long campaign overseas. While you were gone for 5 years, your farm goes fallow, your family falls into debt just to survive.
When you finally return home victorious, an aristocratic neighbor offers to buy your distressed debt and take your land. You have no choice. Your family farm is absorbed into a massive estate.
And you cannot even get a job working on that new mega estate because the aristocrat has populated it with the very slaves you just conquered in Greece.
Free citizen labor simply could not compete with the thermodynamic efficiency of free slave labor.
This dynamic violently suppressed wages across the Italian peninsula. It drove hundreds of thousands of dispossessed, angry farmers away from the countryside and into the dense slums of the city of Rome,
creating a highly volatile, landless, urban proletariat.
You essentially created a massive underclass of furious, impoverished military veterans living in the urban squalor, completely stripped of their dignity and reliant on state grain subsidies just to keep from starving.
Meanwhile, the elite class was drowning in unprecedented luxury. This is the exact manifestation of Edward Gibbon's famous concept of immoderate greatness. The prosperity itself ripened the principle of decay.
The wealth was the poison.
Exactly. But wait, a listener might ask, if the Roman Senate was supposed to govern the Republic, why didn't they just pass laws to stop this land consolidation? Why let the foundation of your military, the citizen farmer, rot away?
Some tried. You had figures like the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They were elite politicians acting as a counter-elite.
They saw the deadwood accumulating. They tried to pass sweeping land reforms to break up the latifundia and give the land back to the poor.
And how did the Senate respond? The senators literally tore up wooden benches and bludgeoned Tiberius Gracchus to death in the streets. They murdered the reformers to protect their wealth pump.
Which perfectly illustrates the cultural decay at the top of the pyramid. The ancient Roman historian Sallust provides a brilliant contemporary diagnosis of this elite breakdown.
Sallust argued that the total destruction of Carthage was actually the worst possible outcome for Rome's internal stability.
Yes, Carthage had provided a vital psychological mechanism called metus hostilis, the fear of the external enemy.
Right. As long as Hannibal or his successors might march over the Alps and destroy Rome, the Roman elite were forced to cooperate.
The stakes were too high for petty squabbling.
Exactly. But once Carthage was burned to the ground and the external threat vanished, the unifying pressure evaporated.
The mos maiorum, the revered ancestral code that demanded frugality, public duty, and sacrifice for the collective good of the state, was entirely discarded.
It was replaced by unrestrained avarice and fierce, zero-sum internal competition.
Sallust wrote these incredibly depressing accounts of the era, noting that wealth became the sole marker of honor in Roman society. Poverty was suddenly viewed as a moral disgrace.
An old-fashioned virtue lost all its political currency. This ties directly back to Turchin's cliodynamics. Without an external enemy, and fueled by global plunder, Rome experienced massive elite overproduction.
You had a bloated class of hyper-wealthy senators and acolytes, completely unconstrained by the old rules, engaging in ruthless, bribe-fueled warfare over a strictly limited number of consulships.
The structural friction became intolerable, and the institutional dam finally broke in 107 BC with the Marian reforms.
Gaius Marius, facing a severe military crisis and a complete lack of landowning citizens to draft, made a fateful thermodynamic shift.
He opened the Roman legions to the capite censi, the landless poor, the very men who had been displaced by the latifundia.
This sounds like a logical solution, right? The poor get jobs, Rome gets an army.
But the mechanical consequence was catastrophic. Because these new soldiers didn't have farms to go back to, they were treating the military as a career.
They relied entirely on their commanding generals to secure land, plunder, and retirement bonuses for them. The Senate wasn't paying them, the general was.
The thermodynamic link between the citizen and the state was severed. The military shifted its absolute loyalty away from the abstract concept of the Roman Republic and toward individual, charismatic warlords.
Men like Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar realized that they commanded private, fiercely loyal armies that gave them ultimate political leverage.
If the Senate denied you a triumph or blocked your legislation, you didn't debate them. You just marched your legions across the Rubicon and took Rome by force.
Civil war evolved from an unthinkable taboo into a normalized, standard tool for political advancement.
The Republic's complex, rule-based bureaucracy was entirely bypassed by the brutal, low-complexity efficiency of military autocracy.
And as these civil wars dragged on for decades, grinding the male aristocracy to dust, we see a fascinating structural adaptation in the historical record. A massive vacuum was created in the civic, economic, and political life of Rome.
Because the men were constantly away on campaign or dying by the thousands in battles like Pharsalus and Philippi.
Right, so the traditional gender roles of the Republic had to adapt to the thermodynamic stream.
I am so glad you brought this up because this is a detail that completely shocked me in the source material. We always think of Rome as this hyper-patriarchal society.
Oh, absolutely.
But the Italian historical sources highlight the incredible rise of the matroni, the elite Roman women, during this exact period of institutional collapse.
Figures like Terentia, the wife of Cicero, Servilia, the mother of Brutus, and Hortensia. Traditionally, a Roman woman of elite status was expected to remain strictly within the domestic sphere, spinning wool and managing the household.
But the sheer systemic exhaustion of the Republic forced these women to step aggressively into the public sphere, simply to ensure the financial and political survival of their families.
They were managing vast, complex agricultural estates while their husbands were exiled. They were negotiating high-level political alliances and mediating between warring factions behind the scenes.
In the case of Hortensia, she literally marched into the Roman Forum and delivered a public speech defying the ruling triumvirate, protesting an unjust tax levied on wealthy women to fund yet another civil war.
And what is crucial to understand is how they justified this radical breach of societal norms. When traditionalists attacked them, these women invoked the concept of pietas.
Not piety in the modern religious sense, but a profound, unyielding devotion and duty to protecting their family line and their patrimony.
They framed their public political actions not as rebellion, but as the ultimate fulfillment of their domestic duty in a time of crisis.
It is a brilliant adaptation, but it highlights just how broken the machine was. When half of your traditional political class is dead or fighting, the system has to pull resources from anywhere it can.
Exactly. This structural shift in gender roles was a direct, glaring symptom of severe, terminal institutional exhaustion. The Republic had hit Tainter's wall of declining marginal returns.
It could no longer afford the complexity of its own competitive, aristocratic elections and endless civil wars. So how does it end?
Octavian, the adopted son of Caesar, eventually wins the final civil war, defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and changes his name to Augustus. He initiates his grand historical reset.
And Augustus is arguably the greatest master of political propaganda in human history. He publicly disguises his new, total autocracy as a restoration of the Republic.
He claims he is bringing back the mos maiorum, the old morals, the old Senate.
But the math had changed.
The math had entirely changed. In reality, the old Republic was dead and buried. Augustus simply institutionalized all of these new, informal spheres of power, including the powerful female spheres of influence within his own centralized household, the Domus Augusta.
He empowered figures like his wife, Livia, to wield immense state power under the guise of familial duty.
The sprawling, fiercely competitive, highly complex aristocracy was streamlined into a single, personalized family business, the Principate.
And from a thermodynamic perspective, why did this work? Why did the Roman people accept a dictator?
Because it radically lowered the costs of complexity. Tainter's economizing process in action.
The public was so exhausted by the friction of elite overproduction that they willingly traded their political liberty for the low complexity stability of an emperor.
Rome represents a political reset where the civilization itself, the people, the cities, the culture largely persisted, simply operating under a new, less expensive management structure.
But what happens when that thermodynamic failure intersects with an absolute, undeniable ecological exhaustion? What if the environment itself changes the rules of the game?
For our second case study, we are leaving the Mediterranean, crossing the globe, and moving forward in time to the dense jungles of Mesoamerica.
We are looking at the terminal classic period of the Maya.
The collapse of the classic Maya, roughly occurring in the 9th and 10th centuries, offers a starkly different and deeply chilling model of societal failure.
And we have to start by tearing down a very pervasive myth. For decades, if you read a textbook about the Maya, it was shrouded in this romantic, almost mystical narrative.
Right. Early 20th century scholars, prominent figures like J. Eric S. Thompson and Sylvanus Morley, looked at the jungle ruins and painted a picture of the Maya as these serene, peaceful, stargazing astronomer priests.
The prevailing theory was that they lived in relatively empty ceremonial centers, gently tending to small milpa gardens, reading the cosmos.
And then one day, they simply and peacefully dispersed into the jungle, abandoning their cities for philosophical or mysterious reasons.
It's a beautiful story. It's also completely, utterly wrong.
Totally wrong. By relying on rigorous Spanish historiography from the colonial period, and more importantly, modern stratigraphic data and LIDAR technology, that agrarian myth has been thoroughly dismantled.
LIDAR, light detection and ranging, has completely revolutionized Mesoamerican archaeology. Researchers fly airplanes over the dense, impenetrable jungle canopy and shoot millions of laser pulses down to the ground.
The software then strips away the digital trees, revealing the bare earth underneath.
And what LIDAR revealed in the Piton region of Guatemala was absolutely shocking. They didn't find isolated ceremonial centers.
They found tens of thousands of previously unknown structures. They found massive, sprawling urban centers connected by elevated superhighways.
The reality revealed by the data was far more brutal and far more complex than the myth. The Maya were a high-density, heavily stressed population.
We're talking about millions of people living in highly organized, interconnected megacities situated within a deeply fragile subtropical rainforest environment.
And to support that massive population, they had engineered incredibly complex infrastructure. They didn't just plant a few gardens. They terraformed the landscape.
They built vast networks of agricultural terraces into the hillsides to prevent soil erosion. They constructed intricate raised fields in the swamps and massive canal systems to manage the seasonal rains.
They were pushing the thermodynamic limits of their environment to the absolute razor's edge.
They had to, because the population density demanded it. And as resources became strained, they engaged in intense endemic warfare.
They weren't peaceful stargazers. They were fiercely competitive city-states, battling over incredibly scarce agricultural land and water access.
And the linchpin holding this entire high-wire civilization together was their political system. It was centered on a concept known as the Kuhul Ajaw, or the divine lordship.
This is where the Maya differs so drastically from the Romans.
This is a critical distinction. The Maya kings were not just secular rulers or military generals. They were literally considered sacred beings.
Their fundamental political mandate, the core source of their legitimacy to rule, was their perceived ability to mediate with the gods and the ancestors to manage the physical environment.
They were personally responsible for ensuring that the rains arrived on time, that the soil remained fertile, and that the agricultural cycle succeeded.
Think about that job description for a second. It's the ultimate bad day at the office. You are literally a god, and your only real key performance indicator is make it rain.
Right. When the weather cooperates, you get to extract massive amounts of labor and wealth from your people to build giant pyramids in your honor.
But what happens when a divine institution cannot solve a physical reality? Because in the 9th century, the climate turned against them.
A series of severe, protracted, multi-decadal droughts hit the Maya lowlands. This raises an important question, one of the most important in all of complexity science.
How does a highly complex society react when its foundational technology, its primary problem-solving mechanism, utterly fails.
Because going back to Tainter's framework, the Maya had already maximized their agricultural complexity.
Right, if you are a farmer facing a drought, maybe you build a canal. But the Maya had already built every possible canal and terrace just to feed their massive population during the good years.
They had already reached the extreme end of declining marginal returns. Every ounce of their societal energy was dedicated to maintaining the current carrying capacity.
When the mega droughts hit, they had zero thermodynamic reserves left. They couldn't invent their way out of the lack of rainfall.
There were no new agricultural innovations left to deploy. The cost of maintaining their sprawling, top-heavy society, feeding the massive royal courts, funding the endless wars, building the monuments remained astronomically high.
But their caloric return plummeted to near zero.
And because the king's power was staked entirely on ecological success, the droughts didn't just cause widespread starvation, they caused a total catastrophic shattering of ideological legitimacy.
If the divine king performs the bloodletting rituals and dances the sacred dances and still doesn't reign for 10 years, what is he good for? Why should the starving peasant continue to haul limestone to build the king's monument?
The social contract disintegrated. The archaeological data from this terminal classic period is absolutely harrowing to examine.
In the dense southern Peton interior, we see a rapid, abrupt cessation of monumental construction. Dates stop being carved on stele.
We see defensive palisade walls hurriedly thrown up around the central plazas of once grand cities, indicating violent internal uprisings or vicious attacks from starving neighbors.
And ultimately, we see a demographic fallout that is almost unfathomable. In the interior lowlands, there was up to a 90% population loss over a relatively short period.
90%. The great cities of Tikal and Copan were entirely abandoned, slowly consumed by the encroaching jungle.
But here we must be extremely careful with our terminology and apply the scientific lens rather than the apocalyptic one.
Yes, this was not an extinction of the Maya people. It was mechanically, just like the fall of the Roman Republic, an economizing reset.
It's just that the cost of resetting in a jungle environment during a famine is paid in human lives.
Precisely. The highly complex, incredibly expensive system of the interior, with its divine kings, its massive labor commands, and its fragile terraforming collapsed because it was no longer thermodynamically viable to maintain it.
The environment could no longer provide the energy subsidy required by the complexity.
So the complex system died, the top-heavy hierarchy was severed, but the people adapted.
Power and population seamlessly shifted away from the drought-stricken, high-complexity interior. They migrated toward the coastal shelves and the northern inland waterways of the Yucatan Peninsula.
Post-classic polities in the north, such as the famous city of Chichen Itza, actually flourished during the exact centuries that the interior was collapsing.
And why did Chichen Itza survive when Tikal fell?
Because they fundamentally changed their operating system. They lowered their complexity costs.
They operated on a different, far more resilient model. They were less centralized. They relied heavily on coastal, seaborne trade networks rather than the fragile, high-cost, hyper-managed agricultural mandates of the Kuhul Ajaw.
The Maya civilization essentially amputated its most expensive, failing institution, the divine kingship of the interior, in order to survive in a new, streamlined mercantile form on the coasts.
That is the raw essence of this historical reset, trimming the complexity that you can no longer afford to carry.
Now, we've looked at ancient ecology and ancient politics. We've talked about swords and spears and stone pyramids, but you, the listener, might be thinking, that was a long time ago. We have modern finance, we have globalized markets, we have the internet and nuclear submarines. Surely we're immune to this math.
So let's test that theory. Let's look at what an imperial reset looks like in a globally integrated, financialized economy. We are moving to the mid-20th century, to the geopolitical earthquake of the 1956 Suez Crisis.
The Suez Crisis is the ultimate textbook modern example of how the loss of state capacity and severe financial overstretch triggers a rapid, undeniable collapse of global hegemony.
To set the stage, we must look at the psychological state of the British Empire after World War II. Britain had won the war, but it was financially exhausted, deeply in debt to the United States, and its industrial base was battered.
Yet the British political elite men like Prime Minister Anthony Eden and his Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, operated under a profound, almost delusional illusion.
They firmly believed that Britain was still a Tier 1 global superpower, equal in footing to the U.S. and the Soviets.
They were heavily haunted by what diplomatic historians called the Munich complex. The traumatic memory of appeasing Adolf Hitler in the 1930s had forged a rigid mindset.
They believed that any concession on the global stage, Any retreat from their imperial holdings would inevitably lead to the total collapse of their global standing.
They explicitly feared that losing control of their assets in the Middle East would reduce Great Britain to the geopolitical status of a minor regional nation like Holland.
So in July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser makes a move that sends shockwaves through Whitehall. He formally nationalizes the Suez Canal Company, taking control of the vital waterway that connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea.
From the perspective of Arabic historical accounts and much of the decolonizing world, this was a triumphant, entirely justified assertion of national sovereignty.
It was Egypt reclaiming its own infrastructure from colonial imperial control.
But to the British leadership, it was an existential threat. The canal was the primary artery for the oil that powered the British economy, and losing it was a fatal blow to their imperial prestige.
So Britain responds the way empires always respond. They flex their muscle. Secretly conspiring with France and Israel, Britain launches a massive, highly coordinated military intervention to invade Egypt and take the canal back by force, Operation Musketeer.
And purely from a tactical military standpoint, they succeed. The paratroopers drop in, the Marines land, they secure the ground, they win the battle.
Which brings us back to our opening cinematic scenario. So, what does this all mean for the mechanics of power? They had the military might to take the canal, so why did they fail?
Why did this victory trigger the end of their empire? Because, as Tainter taught us, power is not just military.
Power is fundamentally thermodynamic.
And in the modern industrialized era, thermodynamics is expressed as global finance. The military operation in Egypt instantly triggered a massive global run on the British pound sterling.
The mechanics of this are crucial. Global markets panic at the geopolitical instability and the potential for a wider war.
International investors and foreign governments started dumping British currency at a staggering rate. Because Britain operated on a fixed exchange rate, the Bank of England was legally obligated to maintain the value of the pound.
To do this, they had to aggressively buy up the dumped pounds using their own precious reserves of US dollars and gold.
It was a financial hemorrhage. The Bank of England was bleeding its reserves dry. They were literally days, perhaps hours, away from total financial insolvency.
If they ran out of dollars, the pound would collapse, Britain would not be able to import food or oil, and the domestic economy would implode.
And here is where the illusion of hegemony shattered, and the reality of their diminished thermodynamic status became undeniable.
Britain desperately turned to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, for emergency credit lines to shore up their reserves.
They assumed the global financial system would bail them out.
But the United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, was furious about the invasion. Eisenhower felt deceived by his allies, and he feared the invasion would drive the entire Arab world into the arms of the Soviet Union.
So, the U.S. weaponized finance. Eisenhower actively blocked Britain's access to the IMF credits.
Furthermore, his administration threatened to start dumping the massive holdings of British sterling bonds held by the U.S. government, which would have instantly crashed the pound.
The U.S. issued an ultimatum. We will not stabilize your currency, and we will watch you go bankrupt unless you agree to an immediate ceasefire and a total withdrawal from Egypt.
It was a brutal, paralyzing wake-up call. Harold Macmillan, who just days earlier had been one of the most aggressive hawks advocating for the invasion, looked at the bleeding balance sheets from the Treasury and instantly flipped.
He famously went from being the first in to the first out. He realized mathematically that they simply couldn't afford their own empire anymore.
This was the definitive, undeniable pivot point for the British Empire. They suffered a rapid, catastrophic loss of sociopolitical complexity on the global stage.
It was the exact moment that their imperial overstretch, the gap between their global ambitions and their actual economic energy, became mathematically undeniable. They had to endure a humiliating, very public military retreat.
The ladder had broken. They had hit declining marginal returns on empire.
The massive cost of maintaining a global military presence and projecting hegemony was actively bankrupting the homeland.
And so, the system executed a forced economizing reset. The Suez failure forced a complete, rapid restructuring of British foreign policy.
It accelerated the decolonization of their remaining territories, forced them to abandon their expensive east of Suez global military posture,
And compelled them to accept their new reality as a regional power, ultimately leading to their economic integration into Europe. They trimmed the complexity they could no longer finance.
which brings this entire sweeping historical briefing full circle. We have journeyed through the structural decay of the Roman Republic.
We have witnessed the ecological and ideological shattering of the Maya Kuhul Ajaw.
And we have tracked the financial breaking point of the British Empire at Suez.
Now we must turn this analytical mirror directly toward the 2026 hook we started with, the United States today.
We must apply these historical blueprints to our current moment.
Now, before we lay out these modern parallels, it is vital that we make our analytical stance extremely clear to you, the listener. In examining the current political, social, and economic climate of the United States in 2026, we are not wearing political lenses.
We are strictly nonpartisan.
We are not endorsing left-wing critiques of late-stage capitalism, nor are we validating right-wing critiques of progressive institutions. The math of cliodynamics does not care about your political affiliation.
A structural breakdown is a structural breakdown.
We are strictly, impartially applying Turchin's demographic math and Tainter's thermodynamic models to the raw empirical data of the present day. We're opening the hood and looking at the engine, entirely independent of who is driving the car.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, if we look objectively at that engine, the exact same warning signs we saw in Rome, in the Piton Jungle, and in London are flashing bright red today.
Let us systematically walk through the structural markers of a society approaching an economizing reset. Marker number 1, a massive failure in information processing.
As a society becomes increasingly complex, the energy required just to reach a consensus on basic facts skyrockets.
Today, in our hyper-connected digital age, we are witnessing a total systemic breakdown in trust. Trust in official government institutions, trust in legacy media, trust in the scientific establishment, and trust in the basic rule of law.
This is eerily, structurally identical to the decay of the Roman Mos Maiorum. When the elite factions of Rome stopped trusting each other, the rules of the game dissolved.
Today, we exist in fractured, competing information silos.
When a highly complex society cannot agree on a shared baseline reality, its capacity to coordinate and solve large-scale problems is completely paralyzed. Problem-solving engine stalls.
Marker number 2, the consumption of reserves. A healthy, resilient society keeps massive surpluses on hand, surpluses of capital, energy, industrial capacity, and domestic goodwill to handle Tainter's stress surges.
But today, the financial strain of maintaining global military and economic dominance, the sprawling network of bases, the trillion-dollar deficits, the so-called forever wars, is acting exactly like the overextended Roman frontier defense or the British imperial overstretch.
We are constantly borrowing against the future just to fund the daily operating costs of the present. The buffer is gone.
Marker number 3, Tainter identified peasantry apathy as a critical terminal stage of societal collapse.
In the final days of the Western Roman Empire, the overtaxed, heavily burdened citizens eventually felt so entirely alienated from the state that they quite literally did not care if the barbarians breached the walls.
The system offered them nothing, so they offered the system no defense.
We see this mirrored perfectly today in the rising apathy of the youth and the working class precariat. We have massive segments of the population who look at the housing market, the cost of healthcare, and the stagnation of wages, and they view the economic status quo as a rigged, zero-sum game.
When the base of your demographic pyramid feels they have absolutely no stake in the survival of the system, the structural integrity of the entire nation is critically compromised.
And finally, marker number 4, the most volatile and dangerous metric of all Turchin's elite overproduction.
The American wealth pump has been operating at maximum velocity for several decades. We have mathematically created a massive surplus of hyper-credentialed, highly ambitious, wealthy individuals.
They all expect to wield power, influence, and status. But the number of actual power seats, the elite administrative and political positions, has not grown.
If you want to know what elite overproduction looks like today, look at the vicious, cutthroat nature of our political primaries or the cultural warfare in corporate boardrooms and academia.
This is Turchin's deadwood. It is creating intense, unmanageable friction among the elite class.
It is generating sophisticated counter-elites who are more than willing to weaponize populism and tear down the foundational institutions of the republic just to claim a piece of the resulting rubble.
The mathematical blueprint of history is completely unambiguous on this point. When extreme elite overproduction, popular immiseration, and the depletion of financial reserves all converge simultaneously, a societal reset is not just a vague possibility.
It is a thermodynamic mandate. The system will forcibly lower its own complexity. However, I want to leave the listener with a final, highly provocative thought. A structural reality that differentiates our 2026 moment from every single historical case study we have discussed today.
It is the concept of the global Goliath. This
Yeah.
is the truly terrifying part.
Because when the Roman Republic fell into autocracy, the Han Dynasty in China was perfectly fine.
When the Maya interior collapsed from drought, medieval Europe didn't even know they existed.
When the British pound collapsed, the American economy surged. Historically, collapses were always geographically isolated.
Precisely. In the past, if a civilization ruined its thermodynamic base, the damage was contained to its specific region. But modern society is entirely, inextricably, completely globally integrated.
Our supply chains for microchips and medicine, our hyperfast digital financial systems, our systemic ecological impacts, they're all tightly woven into a single planetary-scale problem-solving engine.
If a thermodynamic reset happens today, there is no isolated geographical retreat. There is no coastal Chichen Itza to migrate to.
A disruption in the financial base in New York, a shipping blockade in the Red Sea, or a cascading ecological failure in the global grain belts, it spreads everywhere instantly.
The global Goliath means that for the first time in human history, we all share the exact same marginal return curve. We are all on the exact same ladder.
And we are very high up.
We hope this deep dive has illuminated your understanding not just of the ancient past, but of the present and the inevitable future of our global order. The blueprint is there. It's up to us to read it.